All right, welcome back to part two of our two-part series on morality and cooperation. So, in the last class, we talked about how over many thousands of years, we've gradually eliminated from the gene pool some of the most reactively aggressive members of our species. And as a consequence, we've become a less vicious, less interpersonally violent species than we otherwise would have been, or than some of our primate cousins are. But on its own, it's an incomplete story of the moral evolution of our species. It explains how we reined in some of the darker sides of our human nature, but it doesn't explain some of the lighter sides, some of the more cooperative sides, where those actually came from. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, in your readings from last week, you were introduced to the idea of direct reciprocity. Now, many animals have this ability to engage in cooperation between pairs of individuals. This is literally I scratch your back, you scratch my back reciprocity. A helps B, and therefore B helps A. Tit for tat.
Tit for tat.
Well, I'm not showing you my tat.
But humans have the cognitive ability to take this one step further. We don't choose to cooperate with people just on the basis of what they've done to us, but on what we know they've done to other people. So we can track reputations. And once you have that mechanism of reputation tracking, a couple of interesting cooperation dynamics ensue. The first is this idea of indirect reciprocity, which is how helping one person improves your reputation so that other people help you in the future. So imagine you have a group of 6 people, and Rachel does something nice for Joey. Now, having seen that Rachel is a nice person, Ross realizes that he should, if given the choice, cooperate with Rachel. Joey, seeing that Ross is a cooperative person, decides he can cooperate with him. Meanwhile, now Chandler, seeing that Joey is a cooperative person, cooperates with him, and then Monica and Phoebe realize that they can cooperate with Chandler, and before you know it, you have a group of. Now, the effect of indirect reciprocity on increasing cooperation has been demonstrated in countless experiments. When people know that their behavior will be known to future potential cooperation partners, they become less selfish because they know that their future treatment will depend on the reputations that they cultivate. But more recently, the scientific literature has begun to look at another mechanism that comes into play when you recognize that human groups are not static. We don't get to choose just whether or not we cooperate with somebody, but whom we choose to cooperate with. So this is what's called partner choice. Now, this is very clear in the mating domain, as we talked about a couple weeks ago. We compete to be chosen by the people that we want to partner with. But we don't just compete to be mates. We also compete to be friends and allies and trading partners. We compete to be cooperation partners. When you can choose to leave a bad partner and pick a better one, generosity becomes a form of competition. And in that kind of world, generosity and cooperation, it's not just nice, it's attractive. And those who are best able to most convincingly signal their generosity, their cooperation likelihood, those people get the best partnership opportunities. They get the best opportunities to cooperate with the people who are going to be most cooperative back to them. So, because reputation ends up being so important to whether we choose to cooperate with other people and whether they choose to cooperate with us, reputational information ends up being highly prized. And one of the reasons that humans can engage in reputation based cooperation much more so than other animals is that we don't have to rely solely on the reputational information that we collect ourselves. Because we have complex language, we can rely on the observations of others. And that's a lot about what gossip is about. In fact, according to the anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who we're going to talk a lot more about in the next lecture, that's primarily what gossip is about: spreading information about the moral reputations of other people. According to his eavesdropping experiments, the majority of the time that people spend speaking is spent speaking about social talk, that is, spreading information about the behavior and moral reputations of other people. And controlled lab experiments show that when gossip is on the table, that is when people know that gossip is a possibility, when they know that their behavior with person A could be communicated to people B, C, D, and E, they rein in their behavior. Selfishness decreases and cooperation increases. There's another important dynamic that results from all of this. So once cooperation becomes a signal, in this case, a signal of people's moral reputation, it is now subject to all the same dynamics that affect other signals that we see in nature. So you'll recall from one of our early readings, the discussion of the peacock's tail. The peacock's tail, this elaborate plumage, is a wasteful signal from the perspective of the survival of the peacock, but it's a highly effective and impressive signal from the perspective of attracting a partner, in this case, a mating partner. And it needs to be so elaborate and colorful and expensive because that's what distinguishes it as an honest signal, an authentic signal. It is a costly signal that only the strongest and healthiest and most virile peacocks can afford, thereby serving as a reliable way for the peahens to distinguish who amongst the various peacocks is that healthy and strong and virile, and thereby the one that they should actually choose to mate with. Signals of cooperation end up working the same way, but the moment that cooperation becomes a currency, you start seeing people competing over it. So this paper shows that when partner choice is available, once there's a biological market in which people compete to be the chosen cooperation partner, people start engaging in something called competitive altruism. People competing to outbid each other to show how generous they are relative to their other competitors, and thereby being the person who is chosen, not in this case as a mating partner, but as a cooperation partner. And it's not just in generosity. Anything that makes somebody a better cooperation partner or ally is something that you'll see this competitive altruism over. So, this is a paper by the Harvard psychologist Gillian Jordan, which looks at what's called third party punishment. Now, what third party punishment is, it's also called costly punishment or altruistic punishment, is itself an interesting form of cooperation. So imagine you have two people, A and B, and A aggresses on B. So A hits B. Boing. Now, instead of B being the one to hit A back, you have a third party, C, and on behalf of B, taking on the cost for themselves, C decides to be the person to hit A. Now, this is costly for A. First of all, if C gets in a fight with A could retaliate against C, and C suffers those costs, or A could go get another posse of people to attack C, or it's just effortful and metabolically, calorically expensive to actually go do the work of fighting with somebody. And so engaging in this type of third party punishment, being the third party who punishes somebody for what they did to somebody else, is costly. It's altruistic because it's incurring costs on oneself to help somebody else. In this case, to spread the social norm of you don't mess with B. Now, that form of punishment is understood to be a form of cooperation. As a result, in a situation where you have partner choice in a biological market where people are competing to be the type of person who's chosen as a cooperation partner, people not only compete to be highly generous, but people can also compete to be the best third party punisher, the best moralistic punisher, going out of their way to make sure that you punish other people for what they've done to others, showing yourself to be a righteous warrior for the social norms so that you can be the one to enforce them so that you're perceived to have a good moral reputation. Now, in other situations, the signals for being a good cooperation partner don't even need to be cooperation itself. So, in the TED Talk that I assigned as the readings for this week, you saw that in some of our own work, we found that being somebody who puts effort into things, even into useless things that don't produce anything, makes somebody appear more honest and moral. And there you see the signaling logic again. Somebody who is willing to suffer through hardships, even for useless things, maybe especially for useless things, is more likely to be somebody who's going to suffer through hardships to help you out. They're distinguishing themselves as a better potential cooperation partner. And this logic explains a whole bunch of other things which, on at first blush, don't seem to make any sense. These sort of victimless crimes. Why is it that we tend to moralize people who eat too much, or who drink too much, or who sleep around too much, or who gamble too much, or who masturbate too much? All of these, the thing that connects all of these things is that they are associated with low self control. By signaling that you have low self control, you signal that you are going to be more vulnerable to the temptations that will take you away from helping other people, that'll take you away from being a good cooperation partner. In contrast, somebody who is able to resist all these temptations is somebody who's going to be able to put their own immediate desires on the shelf if it comes to the need to actually help you out. Again, there are ways of distinguishing who is likely to be a good cooperation partner and who isn't. Now, this whole logic of indirect reciprocity and partner choice and signaling is not going to play out to the same degree everywhere. We will expect that these effects are going to be amplified in environments that feature something called high relational mobility. Relational mobility refers to how fixed versus fluid people's relationship lives are. And this varies between cultures. In places with low relational mobility, there are few opportunities to meet new people. Interpersonal relationships and group memberships tend to be fixed. You have the same relationships for long periods of time, and there's little freedom to change relationships. In contrast, places with high relational mobility, there are many more opportunities to meet new people. There's more turnover in friendships. That is, if you're unsatisfied with one relationship or somebody's unsatisfied with the relationship you have with them, these relationships tend to break off and you go find new ones. There's a lot of choice in whom to interact with and which groups one belongs to. So, as you can see from this map, you see high degrees of relational mobility in North America, in South America, in parts of Europe, and in Australia and New Zealand. In contrast, the places with low relational mobility tend to be in East Asia and in North Africa, the Middle East. Now, obviously, there's a lot of gray points here which we don't have data for. But what you generally see is higher relational mobility in the West and lower relational mobility in the East. But it's actually not that simple because you're also going to see higher relational mobility in urban centers where people interact with a much higher number of people. And there's a lot of turnover between people moving in and out. So, take New York City, for example, but also places like Dubai. You always have people, new people moving in, lots of people moving out. You're always meeting new friends. You're always making new friends. You're always losing friends. That's relational mobility. Now, the concept was introduced by the Japanese psychologist Masaki Yuki, who's just a very keen observer of the psychological differences between his home Japan and places like Canada and the US, where he's spent a lot of time and done a lot of work. And some of the observations he's made, as well as other researchers of relational mobility, is that there's some pronounced psychological differences and interpersonal differences in terms of how people think and act in places with low versus high relational mobility. In particular, people in places with high relational mobility, where they know that they have to constantly make new friends and keep the existing friendships, otherwise they themselves will be replaced, are constantly trying to advertise themselves more, to put themselves out there as attractive potential partners. Again, not just romantic partners, but also friendship partners as well, and even work partners. So in these places, they have higher levels of self-enhancement, putting their best foot forward, often exaggerating their best foot, showing their strongest qualities. Also, higher need for uniqueness, showing how special they are and how much they should be picked. And then within their existing relationships, they work harder to keep them. In places with low relational mobility, you can trust that your relationships are going to be maintained because people don't have many options if they replace you. But in places with high relational mobility, people are much more on the lookout to see if there's a better partner out there. As a result, people invest more in maintaining their relationships. So they build intimacy faster and they express care and affection more openly. Again, not just in romantic relationships, but in friendships as well. But another funny thing happens when we start living in places with high relational mobility and large group sizes. We start to become less nuanced in the moral views we have of other people. When we live in a small scale society with a fixed group of people that we know for a very long time, we start to develop uh, a nuanced view of various people's moral strengths and weaknesses. We might have a friend who we recognize to be a very charitable person, but doesn't always tell the truth. They might be very loyal to their friends, but not so noble in romantic relationships. We recognize that, at least among the people who are close to us, people all have a complicated profile of good moral traits and bad. But we can only keep track of so many of these complex moral profiles. So when we start living in larger groups with many different people swimming in and out of our social worlds, we start tending to flatten people's complex moral topographies into something much more general, something much more black and white. People is either good or bad. Not good on some dimensions and bad on other dimensions, but just either wholly good or wholly bad. This is the idea of generalized morality, which was presented and demonstrated in this brilliant paper by the psychologist Joshua Jackson and his colleagues. They showed in a whole bunch of different studies this concept of generalized morality. In one set of studies, they showed that the larger people's social networks were, that is, the more people that they tended to have social interactions with, other than their family, in a single week, the more they tended to have this generalized view of morality, the more that they tended to see people in this black and white view of either morally good or morally bad. They showed that over time, as our groups have grown larger, uh, we tend to see people, we tend to discuss people in terms of being a good people and bad people more. But perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence is they looked at the Hadza hunter-gatherers of northern Tanzania. And what Josh and his colleagues found was that among these small bands, they had, as expected, low levels of generalized morality. Instead, they had the type of localized morality where you had those nuanced views of all these people that you'd spent your entire life with. However, there were some members of the tribe who had ventured out of the small bands in Hadzaland out to the urban areas of Tanzania for work. There, they'd been exposed to the types of cultures that emerge in places with higher relational mobility and higher social network sizes. Then they'd come back to the village. And when Josh and his colleagues measured those people, they found much higher rates of generalized morality than you saw among their bandmates who'd lived in these small bands their entire life. Now, the comparison with these hunter gatherers is very illustrative. We've talked about how over the last 12,000 years, we've made this transition from these small bands of about 50 to 100 nomadic hunter gatherers to living in agriculture based settlements. With larger and larger sizes. And that transition, which happened over a relatively short time, evolutionarily speaking, has really stretched and tested our evolved psychology. But over the last 30 years, we've undergone an environmental shift, which could be argued to be even larger. We've gone from a world that's entirely made of atoms to one that's at least partially made of bits. Our transition to the online world has similarly stretched our evolved psychology, creating these striking mismatches. Our social networks, which had moved up from the level of these small bands to the level of cities, have now moved up another level entirely to these kind of interconnected webs of people from all around the globe, uh, all of whom are disembodied, many of whom are faceless, and some of whom are not even human at all, but are AI agents and bots. So, understanding the basic mechanisms of our evolved system of moral psychology helps us understand the challenges that that system is now under. At the same time, it's very important for us to recognize how adaptable our species is to these new types of environments. The two factors that let our species, more than any other, adapt to environments that in many cases stray very, very far away from the environment in which we evolved are intelligence and culture. And that's what we're going to be, in one way or the other, talking about for the rest of the term.